The ability of our front to withstand really massive attacks never ceased to amaze me in the late autumn of 1943, but eventually the Soviets succeeded in driving a corridor 150 kilometers deep through the lines of the 2nd Army and 4th Panzer Army between Kiev and Gomel. Places such as Zhytomyr were recaptured, but generally the Russians did not capitalize on it. Their attacks against army groups north and centre also faltered. In the south, against Army Group A, they crossed the Dnieper and pushed forward their front along a line Cherson, Nikopol, Krivoy, Rog, Kirovograd. The penetration from Melitopol to the Dnieper was especially damaging. The Russians were very adept at identifying and attacking at the join between army groups. On 20th of November, Hitler flew to Breslau to address senior cadets of all Wehrmacht branches in the Jahrhunderthalle. Since the destruction of the Sportpalast, this annual speech could not be held in Berlin, and the current officer intake took to heart his grave admonition that the Volk, if we lose, ends its existence. Therefore, every German soldier must be aware that this grueling war, which our enemies accuse us of starting, but which they wanted, and have forced us into, can have no other ending than a German victory. In order to achieve this victory, everyone must be filled with a single unshakable belief in our eternal Germany. Keitel concluded the address with a recognition of Hitler, who left the hall to a storming ovation and shouts of "Sieg Heil" from the cadets. He was not unimpressed by this echo. Air raids on 22 and 23rd of November caused substantial devastation to the heart of Berlin. The Gauleiter of Berlin, Dr. Grobe, reported personally to Hitler and made particular mention of the outstanding morale shown by the people of the city over the 2 nights. Hitler was again filled with rage and anger against the Luftwaffe, which was never able to stop a raid taking place. He repeated these criticisms in bitter terms on 26th of November at the impatiently awaited aircraft exhibition at Insterburg Airfield. All those in some way responsible for aircraft production were present: Göring, Milch, Speer, Saar, Messerschmitt, Galland, Vorwald and others. In my opinion, the Luftwaffe had repeated the error here of setting out mostly those models which were not yet ready for service. Hitler passed very calmly before the long line of aircraft, which included the newest version of the Me-109, the Me-410, R-234, Do-335 and Me-262. Milch accompanied him with full specifications to hand. Hitler was seeing them 262 for the first time and was very impressed by the look of it. He called Messerschmitt over and asked him pointedly if the aircraft could be built as a bomber. The designer agreed and said that it would be capable of carrying 2 250 kilolauern bombs. Hitler said that is the fast bomber, and gave orders that the Me-262 should be built exclusively as such. Milch intervened at once to explain that only a number of the aircraft coming off the production line could be released to the bomber role, but Hitler insisted. Even Göring, when attempting to have Hitler's decision reversed a few days later, was rebuffed sharply. As it turned out, however, the Luftwaffe could only offer the type as a fighter bomber because a true fast bomber would need extensive redesign for bomb carriage, release gear and sights. Hitler was forced to accept this. On our return to Wolfschanze, I tackled him on the subject in the hope of saving the Me-262 for its fighter role. He replied that in principle I was right, and he wanted as many fighters as possible for the Reich, bearing in mind the existing problems, the worst of which would be the Allied landings in France. We had to do everything to prevent this. The Tehran conference took place on 28th of November. Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin spent a week there, with a large staff of officers and politicians. The results of this conference seeped through gradually, mainly through Papen's source in the British Embassy at Ankara. There had obviously been serious difficulties at Tehran, particularly on the subject of where the landings would take place. Roosevelt had got his way over Churchill for northern France. Churchill wanted to go for northern Greece. Hitler decided from this that Churchill wanted to drive a wedge between the Germans and Russians. The Russians would not agree to this, as it would tend to rob them of the influence they wanted in the Balkans. Hitler assumed from Papen's reports that the invasion was still some way off, and ordered a build-up of defence units on the Channel coast. December on the Russian front was less active than feared. The bombing of the Reich had also slackened, while the British concentrated on picking off the 96 V1 launch ramps. They knocked out a quarter, but these could be replaced. Apparently they worried the British, and this gave Hitler a reason to step up production of these flying bombs. He regretted only that they were not immediately available for use. In December, Hitler ordered the setting up of a National Socialist Command Staff at OKW. General Reich was appointed Chief of Staff. The intention had been in the wind for some time, and had been much discussed in army circles. Hitler had been convinced of the need by Himmler, Bormann, and many SS officers that his internal opponents were spreading anti-National Socialist propaganda through the fighting fronts. Most dangerous were the Seydlitz officers, who disseminated propaganda urging officers and men to give up fighting. Reich was instructed to form and train a National Socialist Command Officer Corps for the front. This went ahead in 1944. The organisation found some recognition since these NSFOs were active in the welfare field, but many commanders would not have them around. The way in which the war developed prevented the institution from realising its full potential. In 1943, for the first time in the war, spent Christmas at home with my family. I was confronted by the realities upon my return to Wolfschanze. On 26 December, Dönitz reported the sinking of Scharnhorst. The battleship had sailed out alone to attack an eastbound convoy in the Arctic, and had been intercepted by a superior enemy naval force. Hitler was blameless here. For some time he had condemned the use of heavy units against enemy convoys as senseless. The Russians had resumed their offensive on the Eastern Front. The first impressions suggested that a major offensive was brewing. Hitler spent New Year's Eve alone in his private rooms with Bormann. What was discussed between them is not recorded. In 1943, the Russians had driven us back from the Don to the Dnieper, and an army group centre section from the gates of Moscow to the other side of Smolensk. It was difficult to divine Hitler's real beliefs about the situation. I attempt to form a picture composed of all the pros and cons. I had a number of conversations with him, and noticed how often he contradicted himself. The Russian victories of 1943 had not worried him too much. The German front lines stood well in advance of our borders. There was still plenty of space in which to operate. The great danger, besides the increasing Russian pressure, seemed to be our failing strength. I was not sure if he was seeing things correctly. In my opinion, we stood in a very much worse position altogether than at the end of 1942. The army group commanders consulted him much more frequently, usually seeking leave to bring the front back to spare their forces and build up urgently needed reserves. But Hitler would rarely agree. The result was a severe bloodletting. The senior commanders had come to the stage where they despaired of ever understanding his leadership. For his part, Hitler could not understand why the senior commanders had lost confidence in him. Yet he would fight on, for there was really no other way. Defensive successes of very short-term value reinforced his confidence, yet he hardly noticed the catastrophic casualty lists. The prospect of rest and replacement was so remote that most had given up hope of it. Despite all this, if the mass of fighting men looked with confidence to the new year, this was due entirely to their belief in Hitler. To the extent that the commanding generals had lost their unconditional belief in Hitler, to that same extent the simple German soldier trusted in his unerring leadership. I had no doubt that this fact alone was responsible for the fronts holding together. During 1943, the importance of the Waffen-SS had increased. At the beginning of the war, and more so since the beginning of the Russian campaign, Hitler had built up these divisions systematically. They embodied all his ideas for a fighting force. Division after division was formed, privileged as to its personnel and material. Thus there had slowly emerged a fourth arm of the Wehrmacht, which by 1943, and more so in 1944, was put to especially endangered sectors of the front. Hitler was extraordinarily proud of these SS divisions and trusted in them and their commanders utterly. At the year's end, I reflected most frequently on how the bomber war would progress. It was quite obvious that we could never make up the leeway between the Luftwaffe and the Allied air forces. Hitler believed that the fighter groups would have new aircraft during the coming spring or summer. I told him that I considered this unlikely. I hoped only that the efforts of Milch to increase the production figures for the old well-known types, such as Me-109 and FW-190, would be successful so that our squadrons would at least have material replacements to be going on with. Nothing more could be expected for 1944. For some time, I had not believed in victory, but neither did I foresee defeat. At the end of 1943, I was convinced that Hitler could still find a political and military solution. In this paradoxical belief, I was not alone. The problems in the armaments field had been heightened by the enemy bombing of recent weeks, which had disrupted production severely. Repairs and rebuilding took time, and this time factor was critical. Speer had a knee injury and a pulmonary disorder, for which he was admitted to Hohenlicken Military Hospital. His representative for army armaments was Sauer, an unusually active rival of Speer with an unacceptably ruthless disposition. Milch was the minister with full authority for Luftwaffe armament. He was subordinate only to Goering. Sauer was not in the least interested in what the Luftwaffe wanted, and rubber-stamped the armaments decisions which suited Hitler. On 4th of January, before Speer's illness. Hitler had held an armaments conference at Wolfschanze, attended by Milch, Keitel, Speer, Bacher, Himmler and Sauckel, the main theme being the labour programme. Sauckel had pledged to procure 4 million workers, for which Hitler promised his full support. He was demanding increased output of the new U-boats and jet aircraft. He had gained a false impression at the Insterburg exhibition of the date of readiness and thought that the first machines with bomb carrying and release gear would be available at the front in February. This was not possible because the bomb mechanism and sights had to be manufactured and would not be ready until May. He had not been advised of this. With great satisfaction, he learned that a special court sitting at Verona on 10th of January had condemned to death all members of the Grand Fascist Council, which had deposed Mussolini on 24th of July 1943. 5 of them were arrested and shot the next morning. Mussolini's son-in-law Ciano was amongst them. His wife Edda fled to Switzerland. On 27th January, Hitler delivered a long address to the Wehrmacht field marshals and generals. 2 days beforehand, they had received in Posen various instructions and had had to listen to a speech by Himmler. Hitler's speech at Wolfschanze completed the course. He spoke about the development of the National Socialist idea in the people as we had experienced it. There was a moment of drama about 3/4 of the way through it. Hitler had said, in the last contingency, if I as supreme leader should be deserted at any time, I must ultimately expect to be surrounded by the entire officer corps with swords drawn for my protection, just as every field marshal, every commanding general, every divisional leader, and every regimental commander expects that his subordinates will stand by him likewise in the critical hour. At this, Manstein made a loud interruption. So will it be, mein Führer. Hitler went on, that is fine. If that will be so, then it will never be possible to lose this war. I am glad to know that, Feldmarschall von Manstein. But Hitler had interpreted this interruption in another sense. He saw in the remark a criticism of himself that he, Hitler, distrusted the officer corps. I have no idea if that was what Manstein was saying in a veiled manner. I did not have that impression at the time, for I was convinced of Manstein's honesty. Hitler continued to speak for another half an hour, and then concluded with the words, I have no other wish than to comply with the natural law that says only he earns life who fights for it, and is ready, if necessary, to sacrifice his life for it. The war in Russia dragged on with undiminished bitterness. Hitler continued to demand that Nikopol and the Crimea be held, but both were lost in the course of the next few weeks, Nikopol on 8th of February and the Crimea in the first half of May. Following the fall of the Crimea, Turkey blocked its supplies of chrome ore, as Hitler feared she would. At other sectors of the front the Russians were being held, but these successes were only temporary. It was almost unbelievable how many new units the Russians were able to keep throwing into the fray, whilst the same old German troops were gradually being worn down. There were no replacements in Germany. Fresh divisions had to be brought up from the south and France. Hitler had to accept that the German perimeter was shrinking. On 10th of April, Odessa fell. At the end of the month, the Russians were along the Tarnopol-Kovel line. Here they stopped when the muddy season arrived. Army Group North was being driven back more slowly, and after heavy fighting and casualties was at the Peipu's Sea in March. At the end of January, Hitler had replaced von Kuchler by Model. On 30th of March, he summoned Manstein and Kleist to the Berghof and relieved them of command. Manstein received the swords to his oak leaves, but his dismissal left an unpleasant aftertaste. In both cases, Hitler proceeded in such a tactful manner that Manstein thought Göring and Himmler had forced him out. That Hitler had decided to part with Manstein and Kleist was due to their disagreement with his current military thinking. It was also at this time that Zeitzler requested to be replaced. Hitler declined, emphatically. Model was appointed to succeed Manstein, while Schörner took over from Kleist. Hitler expected from them greater determination and ruthlessness in leadership. He said repeatedly that 1943 had cost the Russians many casualties, and Stalin's might was beginning to disintegrate. Whether that was his true opinion, I had no way of knowing. He fluctuated between sober observations and unfounded confidence. Whatever the source of the latter, it was not Zeitzler's grim situation reports. Hitler also spoke repeatedly of a possible breach between East and West in the Allied ranks. Here he was overvaluing certain Russian chess moves, behind which I saw Stalin's ice-cold calculations to render his allies pliant. On the Italian front, fighting resumed on 4th of January. The British and American forces operated jointly, and apparently not with particular harmony. Moreover, their operations needed long periods of preparation. South of the Casino Massif, they made a slow advance. Even the successful American landings at Nettuno brought no immediate pressure on us. They needed 8 full days before launching their first attack northwards. Kesselring used the time to erect a successful defensive line. Hitler had pulled troops out of France and the Balkans and demanded that an ignominious defeat be inflicted on the Americans. On 14th February, the day before their next attack, the Americans bombed the monastery of Monte Cassino to rubble. The irreplaceable art treasures of the abbey had previously been brought to safety. There were no German troops in the monastery precincts, but the Americans decided to destroy it all the same. It was an act of pure vandalism. The monks and other residents took refuge in the extensive subterranean vaults and suffered no casualties. The terror bombing of the Reich increased after New Year. On 11th of January, USAAF bombers made daylight raids on the Luftwaffe factories at Halberstadt, Oschersleben, Brunswick and Magdeburg. They lost 59 aircraft shot down for 40 German fighters. The Luftwaffe decided that this should go down as a victory. It had a certain deterrent effect because it put the Americans off daylight raids for a month, although on 20th January, the British made a heavy night raid on Berlin, which caused many civilian casualties. The armaments factories escaped significant damage. Goebbels telephoned his report to Hitler, and next morning there followed another outpouring against the Luftwaffe. On 20th February, the USAF resumed daylight raids accompanied by British and American long-range fighters. Their targets were the fighter factories around Leipzig and the ball-bearing works at Schweinfurt, Stuttgart and Augsburg. Some of these installations were up to 75% destroyed, and fighter production declined by up to 800 machines per month. These recurrent attacks reduced the Luftwaffe armaments program to such a sorry state that Milch visited Speer in hospital to see whether he would take over fighter production. Speer saw the necessity, and after 5 more days' continual bombing of fighter factories by the Americans, the decision was taken to transfer fighter staff to Sauer. Sometime in February, Hitler's press officer drew his attention to an article in a Stockholm newspaper which stated that a German army general staff officer had been found to assassinate Hitler with a pistol shot. Hitler sent for me, showed me the cutting, and told me to do everything I could to prevent such an attempt being made. I discussed possible measures with the FHQ commandant, SS Standartenführer Rattenhuber, who was responsible for Hitler's personal protection. We agreed that with immediate effect we ought at least to introduce a control of briefcases, if not also to search visitors thoroughly for concealed weapons. I asked Hitler how far the control should go. He replied that all visitors should be under constant observation, and heavy file cases, for example, should be watched. He declined to have the strict system of control which Rattenhuber and I had suggested. The new measures did not come into effect in East Prussia for a few days after this conversation. Meanwhile, we travelled by his train to Berchtesgaden, while the walls and ceiling of his bunker were fortified with more concrete. Upon our arrival, I inquired as to what system of security for the control of visitors he proposed to introduce at the Berghof. He was averse even to discussing it, and said he would speak with Rattenhuber. I do not know if he ever did. In any case, I never saw any visible change to the previous security measures. On 28th February, Flugkapitän Hanne Reich was invited to the Berghof to receive from Hitler the award of the Iron Cross First Class and a certificate designed especially by Frau Trost in Munich. The 3 of us took tea in the large hall. Hanne Reich quickly seized the opportunity to speak on her favourite theme of the day, and suggested that a kamikaze squad be formed in Germany and, if necessary, deployed. She informed Hitler of the early preparations which were already in hand and asked for his blessing. Hitler was completely opposed to the idea of self-sacrifice. He spoke out against the idea at length, referring to the new military weapons under development by the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, and the imminent introduction of the new jet aircraft. Hanne Reich knew all about the problems of Luftwaffe production, including the long delivery date for the Me-262, and told Hitler so. He was taken aback by her frankness, and retorted that she was not informed as to the present stage of progress, and could therefore not judge the situation correctly. I was pleased that Hitler had heard of the production fiasco from another source. Yet he appeared unimpressed, and preferred to rely on the false understanding he had, and of which Luftwaffe staff had not so far disabused him. Hanne Reich did obtain Hitler's grudging consent to preparations for a kamikaze commando, although Hitler stressed that he did not wish to be kept informed of its progress in the preliminary stages. When Hanne Reich departed, she left behind a long shadow. Hitler's doubts about the completion dates of the jet aircraft had been awakened. That evening, I had a long conversation with him about her visit. He set very great store by her personal devotion to duty, but remarked that suicide operations could not help the situation. I reminded him of her reservations about the series production and operational readiness of the Me-262. He replied that the Luftwaffe had informed him otherwise, and they must stick to the set dates without question. It was clear to me that evening that he was basing his expectations on a false premise. The Luftwaffe production estimates could only be realised if the centres of production remained undamaged. This could not be guaranteed because the British and American air raids were being aimed with great success at precision targets, and the constant relocation of production areas was costing precious time. At the beginning of March, Hitler authorised the Army General Staff to issue Führerbefehl 11 for strongpoint, commandants and battle commandants. This directive explained that strongpoints fulfilled the same function as the earlier fortifications. Their commandants were to be specially selected hardened soldiers. There followed very detailed supplementary guidelines and orders respecting strongpoints, orders which made very high demands quite impossible of achievement in view of the situation. Hitler persevered with the idea of strongpoints, but in the event the various Russian and American offensives would simply roll over them. On the 2nd of April, Hitler had the Army General Staff issue an order for further army group operations in the east. It stated that the Russian offensive to the south of the front had passed its climax. The Russian has worn down and divided his units. The time is now ripe finally to bring the Russian advance to a halt. In the subsequent text, Hitler mentioned the breakout of Hube's panzer army from an encirclement at Kamenets-Podolsk, which had succeeded despite heavy losses in men and material. There could be no talk of bringing the Russian advance finally to a halt, however, and this order showed how Hitler was beginning to drift away from the true state of affairs. On the 16th of March, a few days before Goering's adjutant Bernd Brauchitsch and I had been promoted to Oberst ahead of seniority, Hitler granted me leave to attend the funeral of my uncle, who had died at the age of 87. The Göttingen Military Cemetery was a worthy resting place. I had a chance to speak to his son-in-law, Major von Boris. He was quartermaster of an Army Group North Army Corps, and complained bitterly about the miserable supply situation. He had lodged repeated complaints with the appropriate OKH bureau without success. This seemed inexplicable to me, and on my return to the Berghof, I initiated inquiries into the foul-up. Boris told me later that at the end of July, supply had been mysteriously restored. We remained at the Berghof. Hitler had invited my wife to join me there, until 16th July. On our return to Wolfschanze that day, I saw a meeting scheduled with Admiral Horthy. Hitler was very put out by the latest Hungarian moves, which suggested to him a volte-face after the Italian example. Horthy arrived at Schloss Klesheim on the morning of 18th March. Hitler told him at once that German troops would occupy Hungary the next morning. Horthy replied that if that were the case, he might as well go straight home. His departure was delayed by a fictitious air raid alarm, and eventually he composed himself sufficiently to converse with Hitler that afternoon before boarding his train for Budapest. During the night, German troops occupied Hungary. When Horthy arrived in Budapest next morning, he found a German sentry at either portal of his front door. Thus was the Hungarian problem successfully resolved for the time being. At the Berghof, during the period March to May, Hitler's main interest had been armaments. The fronts in Russia and Italy had fallen eerily quiet. Hitler expected the invasion in France at any moment, but the enemy seemed content to just continue the bombing. Rommel worked intensely at fortifying the Atlantic Wall. Hitler spoke very often about the new, secret U-boat types and jet aircraft, and told visiting armaments experts that if he had them, he could prevent the invasion. At the beginning of April, Hitler pursued very thoroughgoing talks with Xavier Dorsch, leader of the TOT organization, about bomb-proof factories for fighters. What he had in mind here was the subterranean type of factory, as at Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains, where several thousand concentration camp inmates were working on the Vai-2. Dorsch received orders to look for other possible sites for underground factories. In a conversation with Milch and Sauer, Hitler agreed that from March the production of fighters had priority, and he ordered an increase in the monthly output of fighters for April. This order was a tacit admission that he now accepted the delay in delivering the Me-262. Very heavy air raids on Berlin on 6th and 8th March and on Nuremberg on the 30th gave Hitler fresh ammunition to launch a blistering tirade at the Air Raid Defense Organization and the Luftwaffe. Here he overlooked completely the courageous engagements by our numerically inferior fighter force. Over Berlin the enemy had lost 79, and over Nuremberg 95 aircraft shot down. The Luftwaffe expressed satisfaction with the outcome, but Hitler demanded that higher numbers of aircraft be destroyed. This was not really possible because we lacked night fighters in numbers. Nevertheless, the massacre of enemy bombers over Nuremberg brought about a reduction in British night raids. A scheme which came in for much private criticism was the construction of a large new FHQ in Silesia near Waldenburg. The plan also meant that Prince Pless would have to vacate Schloss Fürstenstein. Hitler defended his instructions and ordered that the construction go ahead. Concentration camp inmates were set to work under Speer's direction. I visited this project twice in the course of the year, and had the impression from the size of the undertaking that it would never be completed. I asked Speer if it would not be possible to influence Hitler to have it stopped, but Speer said that would be impossible. The work stretched far into the future and required huge quantities of cement and steel, which were urgently required elsewhere. Hitler celebrated his 55th birthday at the Berghof, but was not in the mood for festivities. Before the midday conference, he accepted the congratulations of his house staff, and in the dining room settled down in a quiet corner to open a pile of presents from close friends. When Zietzler arrived, however, he went at once to the hall for military discussions. Göring and Dönitz also put in an appearance to present the birthday greetings of their respective arms of service. Another visitor was Huber, fresh from his dramatic success of extricating the 1st Panzer Army from the Kamenets-Podolsk pocket and breaking through to the German lines north of Czernowitz. It was a brilliant achievement, and Hitler expressed his special recognition by awarding Huber the diamonds to his oak leaves and promotion to Generaloberst. Huber delivered a very detailed report about the state of the front, after which a long conversation ensued. Hitler was thinking of making Huber Army C&C. Schmundt had advised this, but Hitler had not made the appointment at the time when the tragedy happened. As Huber left the Führer's presence later that evening, I mentioned to Hitler that Huber was proposing to fly to Berlin in darkness and in an aircraft of the OKH courier staff. This needed Hitler's consent, which he gave, instructing me to select a good crew from the courier staff and to make a thorough preparation for the flight. I did so, and had the impression that everything possible had been done to ensure a safe takeoff. I was awoken in the early hours and learned to my horror that Hube's aircraft had crashed. Hube was dead, his companion Huel injured. When I informed Hitler of the accident, he received the news quietly, as he had done 2 years before when Todt was killed. A few days later, a memorial service was held at Schloss Klesheim, at which Hitler was present. I flew to Berlin to attend the burial at the Invaliden Cemetery next day. I had known Huber since 1930, and had kept in touch with him ever since. I felt the loss of this outstanding man keenly. At about this time, Speer came to Obersalzberg to inform Hitler that he had recovered sufficiently to resume work. As Hitler was currently more preoccupied by armaments than operations at the front, the best place to be was close to Hitler. During his absence, he had been aware of the continuing intrigues to railroad parts of the programme, and in some fields there was complete confusion. Certain personalities needed to be replaced. Firm, clear leadership was essential. He did not return to Berlin until mid-May, but he had all the strings in his hands again and attended the daily conferences to keep Hitler informed. These were the last few quiet weeks of the war. Speer considered that he had to maintain Hitler's confidence, even if he had distanced himself inwardly from Hitler and ignored many of his instructions. Hitler was not deceived. He knew that Speer was no longer convinced of victory. In these 3 months, March to May 1944, I had many conversations with Hitler, who began to confide in me thoughts which until then he had kept private. Once he said that despite his lack of confidence in victory, Speer was the only man who understood the infrastructure of the armaments empire. The industry recognized him unreservedly, and I once heard it said, "When we need especially important war materials, Speer is the only person who can get them rushed through." After Speer had resumed his grip on affairs, the trust between Hitler and Speer was quickly restored. I often received Hitler's views about Göring. He knew the Reichsmarschall of old and described him as brutal and ice-cold in a crisis. He is an iron-hard and ruthless man. In the most difficult of crises, Göring is the right man to have on the spot. His vanities and love of luxury were superficialities which fell away when the hour came. I was surprised that Hitler still held him in such high regard. I had often been present recently when Hitler had sent for Göring to receive a sharp rebuke. When I told Hitler that I could not reconcile this sort of thing with his positive judgment of Goering, he replied that he had to be sharp with him occasionally because the Reichsmarshal was inclined to issue orders without bothering to ensure that they were carried out. Goering was often wounded deeply by these criticisms. Once he confessed to me, "Hitler treats me like a stupid boy." And that was just how it looked when Hitler gave him a telling off. Over the last 2 years, I had had cause to mention certain matters to Hitler, which amounted to a criticism of Goering. I was always nonplussed at how Hitler accepted these reports in silence. I never knew if he ever spoke to Goering about any of them, but if he did, I am sure that he never let on that I was the source, for Goering retained the same friendliness towards me to the end. How Hitler's respect for Goering was reciprocated, I observed during a journey to Berlin in Goering's private train in the autumn of 1943. At the evening buffet, in a very relaxed atmosphere, Goering told me of Hitler's positive attitude towards me personally. He also spoke of the high regard in which Hitler was still held by the German people. This confidence was based on the belief that in Adolf Hitler, Providence had sent them the man who would rectify all the injustices inflicted on Germany since November 1918. This idea went so deep that a German defeat was unimaginable to them. I saw from this remark that Goering was still firm in his belief in Hitler, for he was the type of man who called a spade a spade. In these many weeks at the Berghof, except for the regular situation conferences, Hitler returned to the old routine that had prevailed pre-war. He enjoyed very much the table conversations he had with my wife. Usually they spoke about our children, or the farming on the family estate. It was embarrassing for me when he told her occasionally how happy he was to have me on his staff. He thanked her frequently for having forged such a good friendship with Eva Braun. From many evening fireside chats, I realized that Hitler was really a man without contradictions. Despite many assertions to the contrary subsequently, I could not say that he was always changing his opinions about things. His judgments of people, historical personalities, and history remained the same. He spoke a great deal about his ideal of the European state, in which it would be his objective to fight Jews and communists, and to destroy their influence in the world in every respect. He believed firmly that Providence had given him this task. He had an astonishing sixth sense for events, and it was disturbing now to observe how his contact with reality was tending to slip away. At the daily situation, conferences the enemy build up for the Channel invasion, and the resumption of operations in Russia and Italy could be discerned as imminent. At the centre point of Hitler's considerations was the Me 262. In the end, his desire to have it as a fighter bomber failed owing to unsurmountable technical difficulties, principally the alteration to the centre of gravity in the fuselage. A bomb-carrying capacity practically deprived it of airworthiness. It was definitely completely unsuitable as a bomber. In a long talk at Obersalzberg on 23rd May, Goering explained all this to Hitler, who refused to accept the report. As far as possible, he wanted all superfluous equipment to be removed from the aircraft to make weight for at least one 250 kilo bomb. Milch, Galland, Peterson, the commanders of the Luftwaffe test centres, and others were unable to convince him that it would not work. Thus, we simply had to wait until Hitler found out the hard way. I set everything down in a memorandum and took up the subject with him again one evening. I succeeded in convincing him of the special technical difficulties of the jet in comparison to propeller aircraft. Hitler conceded that altering the purpose of the Me 262 from fighter to bomber would create technical problems, but these had to be taken into account. I explained that my reservations were valid only for the change in purpose. As a fighter, the type was first class. It was a very long conversation. Hitler regretted only that the jet bomber design had not been contracted for earlier. I answered him by pointing to the postponement of the Luftwaffe production program in favour of the army since 1940. These conversations about the Luftwaffe led to a decision at the end of May that the entire responsibility for Luftwaffe production should come under the umbrella of Speer's ministry. The transfer was made in early June, after which Milch was relieved of his duties and retired to his hunting lodge north of Berlin. He was in the picture as no other about Luftwaffe production problems, and knew that the Air Force was not adequate for the demands to be made on it in the near future. During the spring, when I visited him with my wife, we had a long talk, and therefore I knew his honest opinion as to how the war was likely to proceed. He had never been shy of stating his views to Hitler and Goering, but the problem with Hitler was that he was always looking for a new solution and would not meet a problem head-on. In May, the USAF began daylight raids on our hydrogen works. The Luna Werke at Merseburg and at Plönitz north of Stettin were the first to be attacked. The damage was substantial, and reports stated that production would be suspended long term. Hitler insisted on an immediate resumption of production. A vast force of top organisation workers was set to the task of rebuilding, and after a few weeks the factories were almost as good as new until fresh bombing put them out of action again. In subsequent months, we always managed to repair bomb damage at hydrogen works in a relatively short space of time to enable the fuel requirements of the Wehrmacht to be met, even if they had to accept severe rationing. On 22nd of May, Speer invited me to be his liaison officer to Hitler at FHQ, Hitler having previously given his assent. Speer was now so engrossed in his task that he found it advisable to keep Hitler informed with running reports. Almost every week he sent me a memorandum to pass on. This would be as likely to contain information about damaged factories as statistics about panzers, aircraft and munitions. Hitler usually read these reports upon receipt, and would have me note down his reply to phone through to Speer at once. Cooperation like this between the two of them was very effective. Speer expected the Americans and Russians to launch their major offensives in 1944, and believed that we would not be able to withstand the pressure. On 11 May, an artillery hurricane of 40 minutes duration heralded the resumption of fighting on the Italian front. Kesselring's units acquitted themselves well, and it was not until 3rd June that the Americans were at Rome. Kesselring ordered that there should be no fighting in the city itself, and placed his divisions around Rome in such a manner that there would be no street fighting. Even the bridges over the Tiber he had left intact. During June and July, German forces withdrew into the Apennines. In August, the Americans assembled their first small bridgehead across the Arno. At the beginning of June, Hitler devolved all responsibility for the Italian theatre to Kesselring. It was extraordinary how it became an independent minor threater with no especial problems except enemy air superiority. Their aircraft flew constant raids against roads and railways during daylight hours, so that German forces moved only by night. Despite this, Kesselring succeeded in holding the front together. The invasion began in the early hours of 6th June. Hitler had been expecting the landings from the beginning of April, whereas OKW considered that no invasion need be reckoned with in 1944 at all, on the grounds of the prevailing unfavourable weather conditions. On 4th June, Rommel had gone to Ulm for a few days' leave, while other army commanders and many general staff officers were not at their respective HQs. One had the impression that there was a low state of alert in force. On 5th June, wireless monitoring had reported indications that the Allies were planning something extraordinary, but neither General Dolman's 7th Army, which stood directly on the invasion front, nor the OKW at Berchtesgaden, was advised. The general reaction in Normandy seemed to be one of awaiting developments. In the darkness on 6th June, an enormous armada headed for the French coast, between the Orne estuary and the eastern side of the Cotentin Peninsula, near Stemer-Église, the sector where Hitler had always anticipated the invasion. The most punishing blow that morning was the parachute drop by 3 divisions into the 7th Army's sector. Enemy air superiority was clear-cut. Their aircraft patrolled the skies almost unmolested, and our troops were unable to move by day. Hitler was informed of the invasion that same morning. During the midday conference, Jodl reported the early details, which left no room for doubt as to the massive scale of the troop landings. Our coastal defences were outnumbered, and reinforcements were having to be brought up during the short June night. Hitler expressed relief and said that it would be possible to defeat the invasion. This was expecting a great deal of our troops. Using his air superiority, the enemy had gained a foothold and had succeeded in establishing landing heads on the coastal stretches which could not be removed. By that same evening, it was already clear that the invasion was a success. I was unable to understand Hitler's attitude. He still seemed convinced that the invasion force could be thrown back into the sea, despite the enemy's air superiority and the huge amounts of material coming ashore unchecked. The situation was that the army stood alone, and Hitler was forced to recognize for the first time what enemy air supremacy really meant. His many conversations with Speer on the subject of finding something to oppose it on equal terms were completely unrealistic. I took the opportunity to speak to Hitler about these ideas for the Luftwaffe. I said it was out of the question to think that an 80-year upsurge in aircraft production could be brought about in a few weeks. We had to do what we could with the existing fleet, but we were hopelessly inferior to the enemy. He listened quietly. I think he probably accepted what I said, but he still continued to ply Speer and Goering with great demands for aircraft construction. The first batch of V-1 flying bombs was ready for dispatch in the second week of June, but the initial launch was a flop. At the last moment, OKW brought forward the operation by 2 days, and this interfered with the timetable for completing the heavy prefabricated launching ramps. 2 nights later, 244 V-1s started off. Reconnaissance aircraft reported numerous fires in and around London. The deployment of the V-1 and from September the V-2 rocket caused heavy damage in the British capital. The campaign was a triumph for Milch, who had been forcing the project through under great difficulties since mid-1942. Hitler expressed his satisfaction to Milch. The program lasted only until US and British forces overran the territory in which the launch ramps were sited. On the 16th June, I flew with Hitler to Metz, where we joined a road convoy to FHQ Margraville near Soissons. Here, Hitler had arranged to talk to the Western Front field marshals. This was a thoroughly unpleasant reunion. That morning, Rundstedt reported on events over the preceding 10 days, and implied that he could not eject the Allies from France with the forces at his disposal. Hitler was enraged and pointed with his usual flourish to the Vi-1 and the Me-262 jet, which would soon be making its appearance. The field marshals demanded that the V-1 be used against the build-up of military forces in southern England and the landing places in France. This was not possible because the flying bomb dropped when its revolution counter reached a fixed point and could not be aimed at a target. In the afternoon, Hitler had a private conversation with Rommel. I did not find out what was said until a few weeks later. Rommel attempted to convince Hitler that the war was lost and that no effort should be spared to bring about a negotiated peace. This was the last thing that Hitler needed to hear from a field marshal. Voices were raised as Hitler endeavoured to bring Rommel round to his own point of view, but eventually he saw that it would not work. We returned to Metz in the afternoon of 17th June and flew from there to Salzburg. The visit to Margraville had been singularly unfruitful, but at least we knew how things stood with the Allied landings. When the Americans took the Cotentin Peninsula and Cherbourg, Hitler flew into a rage and demanded the fullest possible report. This did not affect the catastrophic development. By 20th of July, the Allies had gone on to erect a front which stretched from the Dives estuary on the west to the west coast of Cotentin, at Lessay through Saint-Lô. Hitler viewed this with unease, but at least accepted, if with the greatest difficulty, that the enemy had seized the initiative. His prospects were now reduced to hopes of a breach in the Anglo-American alliance. He was firmly convinced that this breach would be decisive for the outcome of the war in Germany's favour, and he said as much to all of the many callers at the Berghof from Wehrmacht, State and Industry. There were many who left his presence confident and optimistic after this dialogue with him. In his speech to senior officers in the Platterhof at Obersalzberg on 22nd June, He did not deny the gravity of the situation, but expressed to this discriminating circle the hope and belief that the breach would leave the German Reich free to carry on the struggle. The German officer must be an example and possess the strength to lead his men, come what may. His listeners departed confident, their belief in Hitler reinforced. That evening General Dietl arrived. There was a danger that the Finns were thinking of a peace treaty with the Soviets. Hitler wanted to concentrate on this theme, but Dietl was concerned with other problems too. He considered that Hitler was badly informed about northern Finland and Norway, and had a false picture of the situation. We were surprised at Dietl's clarity of purpose and his sharp tone. He would not let himself be deflected from his agenda. Hitler said little and conceded Dietl's demands for more men and materials. When Dietl left, Hitler complained that only very seldom did he get to hear reports presented in such a manner, since most generals, through either temperament, tact or awe, did not feel at liberty to be so candid. Hitler wished only that all his generals were like Dietl. The subject of his admiration left the Berghof late that evening on a schedule which would return him by air to Norway next day. It came as a terrible shock to learn that his aircraft had crashed on the Semmering, killing all aboard. This loss hit Hitler as hard as the death of Hoob 3 months previously. He confessed this in the obituary which he delivered during the state memorial ceremony at Schloss Klesheim a few days later. He had known Dietl since the early 1920s and referred to him as that officer who on the one hand made the hardest demands of his men, but on the other was caring as to the fate of his subordinates, to whom he was a true father and friend, a National Socialist, therefore not in name only but by his will, by conviction and from the heart. And this was a good description. The heavy fighting on the invasion front resulted in the submission of confusing and often contradictory reports from the various battle HQs and command posts. The SS units involved in the hardest fighting were still confident. The sober reports of Rundstedt and General Geyer von Schweppenberg, C&C Panzer Group West, struck a different chord. To clarify matters from the end of June, Hitler had invited Klug to attend all military conferences at the Berghof, unsuspecting of Kluger's close connections to resistance circles, although he had not joined them unconditionally. The atmosphere at the Berghof was friendly, and Hitler had such confidence in Kluger that on 1st of July he made him Rundstedt's successor, Geyer von Schweppenberg, also being relieved of his post. The Foreign Armies West Bureau at OKW was of the opinion that there were about 60 Anglo-American divisions in England. This estimate led Hitler to assume that a second landing would occur in the Pas-de-Calais, and he reinforced the divisions of General von Salmuth there. The estimate was false, since the Allies had no more than 15 divisions in England, and these were also intended for the Normandy beaches. Hitler was convinced that his new C&C West would succeed in erecting a strong defensive front. On 22nd June in the east, the third anniversary of the German invasion of Russia, the Red Army began its offensive against Army Group Center, their largest and most successful operation of the war. At first, it appeared that the Russians' attack was composed of several minor operations, but once they had battered the first gaps in the German lines, a major tank attack developed on the Vitebsk front, and was quickly succeeded by further attacks. The Russians paved the way for every advance by air attacks and a heavy artillery barrage before sending in their mass tank groups. Busch, C&C Army Group Center, asked Hitler for permission to abandon the strongpoints, but Hitler declined and demanded that every centre should be held. The Reich was now under threat from the direction of France, Italy and Russia. Hitler reiterated his strict order that every square metre of territory was to be defended to the last. It was everywhere obvious that the enemy strength was either superior to our own or far superior. Hitler could not see this and considered the army reports exaggerated. Busch, C&C Army Group Center, was replaced by Model, and Lindemann, C&C Army Group North, by Fresner. But these changes of command altered nothing. Army Group Center had lost 25 divisions, about 350,000 men. A 300-kilometre long gap had been torn open along the front, and the Russians were pouring through it towards the German frontier. On 9th of July, Hitler flew to his East Prussian FHQ. In his entourage were Keitel, Dönitz, Himmler, Judel, and Korten. From the Eastern Front came Model, Friesner, and Generaloberst Ritter von Greim, the Luftwaffe C&C Center. The Chief of the Army General Staff, Zeitzler, did not come. Since the beginning of the Russian offensive, Hitler had had a number of shouting matches with him. Zeitzler did not share Hitler's military policy ideas and was at the end of his tether. Hitler never saw him again. The conference was aimed primarily at pushing up new units to the front. Model and Friesner both had a somewhat optimistic outlook. Requirements indented for would be met within the next few weeks, provided that the Russians did not undertake any surprise thrusts in the interim. Dönitz stressed the need to hold the Baltic ports, which were important for working up the new U-boat types. That afternoon, Hitler flew back to Salzburg. I had the impression that he still had a positive view of events on the Eastern Front. At Obersalzberg, during one of the daily conferences, I had occasion to leave the room, and before returning, sat in the annex, which was screened from the room by a curtain. I overheard Hitler praising me for being the only officer who always expressed his opinion openly and without timidity. This observation gave me the determination, at this critical hour for the Reich, to remain bold. I did not rejoin the conference, since I would not have been able to look any of them in the eye. The final days ever spent at Obersalzberg were calm and serious. Hitler wanted to return to Wolfschanze, but had postponed his departure, because the conversion work on his accommodation bunker was still incomplete. At this time, I gained the impression that he saw defeat ahead. I inferred this from comments he made when speaking of the new weapons and their effect. These would bring us success, he said. He would never give in. Everything strengthened his conviction. I will never capitulate. Hitler often discussed Luftwaffe reconstruction with me. Now he had decided to concentrate entirely on the production of fighters. These would have the highest priority. Everything else would be stopped. He expressed the hope daily that the first jets would soon be arriving in front-line squadrons. I could not support this hope. The Me-262 could not be expected for at least another 6 months. My great fear, which I did not conceal, was lack of fuel. Some Army Group Centre units had reported severe shortages. Hitler said that what it amounted to was a struggle to protect the most important production centres and maintain the airworthiness of fighters. He acknowledged the fuel problem, but said we must never give up the chance to obtain the upper hand. How we were supposed to do that without any fuel seemed to escape him. On 15th of July, he decided to return to East Prussia next morning. The Berghof circle was much reduced, and there were few guests around. He had become much calmer in himself. On that last evening before retiring, he went into the large hall, moved once more down the long line of portraits, looked at each, and took his leave of them. Then he bade Frau Wolf and my wife good night, kissed the hand of both, went up the steps to the bedrooms, turned, made a warm gesture of farewell, and left the hall. It was the last goodbye. Next morning we flew to Wolfschanze. The Situation Conference began at 1300 in the barracks annex. It seemed as though we had never been away. Hitler was given quarters in the finished guest's bunker. I admired his resolve. The strength of his will and nerves impressed me. He was a little more round-shouldered than before, and he carried himself less well, but his mind was clear. For him this was a new beginning at FHQ. In these military surroundings he was in his element. Bad reports flowed in from all points of the compass. I had the impression that the army was near exhaustion. There could no longer be any doubt about the enemy's superiority. On the 17th of July, in the west, Rommel received head wounds when the open car in which he was travelling to the front was strafed by fighter bombers. His driver was killed. When Rommel had recovered sufficiently, he was returned to Germany, and he never went back to the front. 2 days later, Kesselring arrived at FHQ. On 20th of July, he celebrated 40 years of military service, and in recognition, he was due to receive the highest decoration, the Diamonds to the Oak Leaves and Swords of the Knight's Cross. It was an enjoyable visit. Despite heavy attacks by American, British, Polish and French forces, none had succeeded in collapsing his Italian front. Hitler spoke to him in a very appreciative manner about his cleverly calculated defensive battle and praised the fight he was putting up against the stiffest odds.